You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Matthew Lipka, Head of Policy at Nuro. We chat about how autonomous delivery can get people groceries, the difference between transporting goods and people, and whether people can pick their own produce. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by the Overhead Wire Media's production of Raymond Unwin's Town Planning in Practice. If you want to purchase our recent audiobook production of this 1909 classic, go to raymondunwin.com and click on the link to Awesound. There you can download it as a podcast series where each chapter is a new episode. You can also get it wherever audiobooks are sold. Today's podcast is also brought to you by our super generous Patreon supporters. Thanks so much to those that listen and support each month. We really appreciate it. And now, if you'd like to get a hold of our bus-only soccer-style scarf with dedicated lane designs, donate $10 or more a month on Patreon and we'll send one along. We also really appreciate the $1 or $2 a month support. So if you'd like to sign up and keep us going, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire. You can also purchase the scarf by going to theoverheadwire.com. And I would be remiss if we didn't mention the Overhead Wire newsletter. We've been doing it for 14 years, and I hope to be doing it for 14 more. We're now at 67,000 links tagged by topic and city for subscribers. Sign up today for a 2-week trial by going to theoverheadwire.com. Before we get to this week's show, I want to let folks know that they can get this podcast wherever you find your podcasts, including iHeartRadio, Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, and of course, Apple Podcasts. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And subscribing means you get both this show, Talking Headways, and Mondays at the Overhead Wire, where this music I'm talking about comes from, on the same feed. 2 fun podcasts, 1 great channel. Subscribe today. Well, Matthew Lipka, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Jeff. It's great to be here. Excited to talk with you today.
Good to chat with you too. Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So my current role is that I'm the head of policy at Nuro. I live in Washington, D.C. Before this, I was a transportation consultant at McKinsey and went to law school, worked a bit in the federal government during law school, and I worked at the MTA in New York for a while as well.
What got you interested in cities and transportation?
I read a book called The Power Broker as a teenager. Familiar, I'm sure, to many of your listeners. And he's kind of a hero and an anti-hero, Robert Moses, in that book. And the thing that stuck with me was how consequential the decisions that were made 60 years ago. I'm from New Jersey, and a lot of family in New York. So I grew up driving these roads. And when we drive to JFK, I would see there's no transit. And that's because of decisions that were made, 50 years ago. And when we drive to Jones Beach, I would see that there's not room for buses to travel because he wanted to make it impossible for Black people to get to Jones Beach on buses. And so that really just inspired me to see, how permanent these changes are and how consequential. And of course, there's a chapter in there about building 1 mile of highway through a vibrant neighborhood and how it basically disrupted the lives of thousands of people. And so I saw how it could be bad as well as how it could be inspiring with how great it was once you got to Jones Beach, and made me excited to enter this field and see if we can make it a little bit better.
So let's get into Neuro a little bit. What is Neuro and what was the initial impetus for the company?
So Nuro is a robotic startup. We're about 4 years old, and we're building a fully autonomous on-road vehicle specifically for goods delivery. So the original impetus for this, it was that our co-founders have been working on self-driving for quite some time. One of them was on the original Google self-driving car team. The other one ended up there after being in the DARPA Urban Challenge. And they felt that how can we get the benefits of this technology into people's lives faster? And they came up with the idea of focusing really on goods delivery. And I mean local delivery, things like groceries, pizza, pharmacy, the errands we do every day when we're driving in our car. And that's something that would be really powerful because we're spending a huge amount of time doing shopping and errands. It's about 43% of all the vehicle trips. So actually twice as much as commuting that we spend so much time focused on in our planning. But we can make a big impact in daily life, giving time back, but also we could get this technology to market sooner in a way that actually helps people. Because if you're just focused on goods, there's a number of things you can do differently, but most simply you focus on protecting everyone outside the vehicle instead of what's inside the vehicle. And that lets you build a safer vehicle, lets you make choices that are designed to prioritize others. And we've seen that already because Neuro's on the road, and we're doing deliveries of groceries and pharmacy in Houston today. And we've been operating for about 2 years in Arizona and in Houston with a delivery service that's driven autonomously.
What are some of those differences between delivering goods versus delivering people when you have to, say, go for approvals or when you're designing the vehicle, those types of issues?
Yeah, so I'd say there's a number of things. There's, different kind of public trust environment, differences in regulation, differences in how you design the software, and differences in how you design the vehicle, and then also in terms of the impacts it has on society. So if we think about kind of technology to start, if you imagine you come upon a brick in the road, right? A vehicle that has no people in it can slam on the brakes much harder than a vehicle that needs to think about occupant comfort. Right? Because you might have whiplash if you're a passenger, but you can really focus on making decisions that are designed to protect others. And that's not just a brick, right? Also a person on the road as well. And you also can take more conservative route choices. We don't have someone in the back seat that could be impatient. That lets us choose areas where we're confident in operating autonomously before we go to areas where it might be more aggressive. And that means we don't have to take the shortest route in every case. We can take the safest route. Another big difference is in the design of the vehicle itself. And this is one that I'm particularly passionate about because I think that there's a lot of things we can do better about our vehicle design, especially for pedestrian and cyclist safety. And so with Neuro, we've built a custom vehicle. It's called the R2 for Robot Generation 2, which is a extremely creative name.
Are you sure it wasn't a copy of Star Wars?
Well, it was not. It was not. Lucasfilm and Disney, it was not a copy of R2. The first one was called R1 for Robot Generation 1. And so this is just the second one. But we're investing so much in safety that we didn't invest in marketing. So.
I appreciate that a lot.
So anyway, so R2 is a custom vehicle. We built it in Michigan in partnership with Roush. And this vehicle is designed from the ground up to be for goods delivery. So there's no space for humans of any kind. And the biggest impact of that is that you've reduced the risk exposure on the roads by 50%, because if anyone hits us, no one in our vehicle can get hurt. We also can actually redesign the vehicle and start to rethink the car and say, how do we build a more socially responsible vehicle? It could be narrower. We don't have to have two seats next to each other. That gives us an extra 2 to 3 feet to maneuver around pedestrians and cyclists. It can be lighter weight. Right? We don't have all the extra steel. This is designed for protecting pedestrians. That means that you can improve your stopping distance. And we can even rethink the design of the front of the vehicle. So Neuro's vehicle is operating in neighborhoods because that's where grocery stores and things are, right? We're in your neighborhood. And so there's a lot of pedestrians around. And so we really focused on that use case and thinking about the front of the vehicle. We said, why do we need a windshield? There's no one inside to see out. Why do we need an A-pillar, which can be very damaging for a pedestrian in a collision? Let's change that into a crumple zone that absorbs energy, sacrifices the goods inside, but prioritizes other road users. Thankfully, our top priority is to never be in a crash. We haven't been in any crashes, but this kind of design of the vehicle, we can reimagine. We've been thinking about putting an airbag on the outside of the vehicle for a few generations that is designed to protect a pedestrian's head in the event of a collision. So I think there's a lot you can do to rethink the vehicle. So I'll pause there for a minute before we going through my long list of 5 differences.
And the vehicle speed is low too. I mean, it's not likely to get into a high-speed crash unless there's another vehicle that crashes into it.
That's right. So right now our vehicles are limited to 25 miles an hour. It's great from a technology perspective. It's great from a piloting perspective. It's also driven a lot by the federal regulations that basically assume if you're going over 25 miles an hour, you've got to have manual controls, steering wheels and brake pedals, and occupant protection things like seat belts and a driver's seat that don't make sense if there's never going to be anyone in the vehicle. But it's great for initial driving. And in these communities, most of the roads are 25 miles an hour. But as we look to the future, we don't want to be limited to just a very select group of neighborhoods. We think that a 35 or 45 mile an hour vehicle could reach many more people in suburbs and rural areas. And I think that's important to recognize that ultimately we're going to need to go a little bit faster. One of the neighborhoods in Houston that we've done some driving in is the Third Ward, which is a food desert. And that community, you've got to cross a highway to get to. And if you're limited to 25 miles an hour, it's difficult to reach places that by definition are further from supermarkets and reach them in a timely way with, fresh hot food. And so if we want to be this service to be more equitable, we know that in our next generation, we're going to need to go a little bit faster.
You mentioned the third ward. We had Mayor Turner on a number of episodes ago to talk about the Complete Communities initiative. How have you all been engaged in that program specifically? And I know that you all are testing the vehicle in that space, but then you also had mentioned at one point in some of the stuff that I read that, you were connected to that program, which is really fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. So we opened our first depot in Houston in Gulfton, which is one of those complete communities. And this program, the Complete Communities, is really designed to concentrate resources from the city of Houston and also private sector in these communities. And so we launched our first depot there. And so that's where many of our employees are located. Our depot is where we store the vehicles, charge them overnight, and maintain them. And so that's in one of these communities. And so we've gotten more connected with the city through that location. But I think there's more to do, of course, here. We've really tried to engage with the city to see what are their priorities and how can we help. And so we're hoping to do more to advance those priorities in the future. And the complete community is a great place to start.
Have communities been more welcoming since they understand that your premises are a little bit different than passenger vehicles? It feels like there might be a little bit more openness to, say, testing if you know that the company is going 25 miles per hour, if they're focused on pedestrian safety, if they don't feel intrusive, unlike some of the other self-driving passenger vehicle companies where they're testing their vehicles. And obviously there's been some tragedies that have happened. Is there a difference in kind of feeling when you come into a community?
Absolutely. I think there's three big things that people see that make them trust autonomous vehicles more. So the first is exposure. Second is whether it's cargo or passengers. And then the third is the speed. So there was a survey, I think it just came out this week by the group Motional, that found that only about 10% of people that say, I don't know much about AVs, would trust one to get it in it. And then people that say, I know a lot about it, 70% would say they would get in it, right? Once people actually understand how the technology works, have seen it in action, that is easier to trust. And it's really on us as an industry to go out and explain how this technology works, what the benefits of it are, and how they can, in their individual lives, benefit from it. And that's why it's so exciting to actually run a real service, because people are actually interacting with this in a way that's productive, right? It's not just testing, it's actually dinner showing up at your door. I think the second thing is around cargo. There's another survey by the Partnership for Autonomous Vehicle Education that asked people what would make them trust the vehicle more. And the second highest rating thing was if it's carrying cargo rather than passengers. Right? And that just kind of makes intuitive sense. It's easier to trust a vehicle that shows up at the curb with dinner, with a pizza inside, than it is to put your whole family in the backseat. And so we think it's a great way to build trust in the technology for everyone. And then the third, as you mentioned, is having that lower speed and seeing it operate safely. Really, I think can build more trust in this technology.
Going back to the question about passengers versus freight or cargo, how much easier is it to get approvals from cities? And kind of goes back to your answer just now, but you all have gotten approvals to operate these vehicles even though they don't have steering wheels and side mirrors and all that stuff. How much easier is it to get approvals in that sense than it is for a passenger vehicle?
Yeah, I think that it's got to make a difference, right? You think about side view mirrors. There's a reason we need side view mirrors in a passenger car, in addition to the driver, is that when you open the door, you want to make sure you're not opening it up into a cyclist, right? So knowing that we'll never have a pedestrian in the vehicle, and that, by the way, our vehicles have gull wing doors that open straight up and only on the curbside, so we'll never door a cyclist, which I particularly appreciate as an avid scooter and cycler around the city. I think that this makes it intuitively easier. Plus, the understanding there's no one inside the vehicle, it just reduces the risk exposure significantly, because if you actually think about it, there's nothing substantively different about when we're operating this in a commercial service versus if we're operating it just for testing. Right? We're doing the same drive either way. The question is whether there's a pizza inside. So you're not actually creating any risk exposure, incrementally by allowing the operation. So I do think it resonates. Secretary Chow had a really good tweet when she announced the exemption that said, a vehicle is never going to have anyone inside it, doesn't need mirrors or windshield. It's just doesn't make sense. It's just common sense. I think that is right? It's intuitive to people that this doesn't add safety to the vehicle. It just makes it wider and in some cases heavier and more rigid.
You all are focused on safety a lot more, it feels like, than other companies. And maybe that's not fair to them. but it feels like that. What brought you to that conclusion that it was important to think about all these other vulnerable road users and think about pedestrians and cyclists and everybody else that might be interacting with the vehicle on public streets?
Yeah, well, I won't speak badly about any other company. I think that the reason safety is so critical is just the number one question for our communities. And we're operating in these neighborhoods, and we need to build trust if we're going to have a successful business. One of our core values is do the right thing. And that means building a vehicle that is safe. And even if it means we have to take a little bit longer to do something, then we'll take that extra time to make sure that we operate safely. And we know in these communities that we are often seeing pedestrians. And so that, I think, is really a reason for it to be a priority, is because that's what we're seeing around us. For me personally, I've been observing over the last many years that so many of the vehicles that are on our roads are getting bigger and wider and heavier and frankly more dangerous. Now we're at a point where 3 out of every 4 vehicles sold is an SUV or a pickup truck. And there's studies showing this is 2 to 3 times more likely to kill a pedestrian if you're hit by a pickup truck or an SUV than a sedan. And of course, these vehicles are also creating many more emissions. Right? Over the last decade, the second biggest cause of global carbon emissions was SUVs. More than heavy industry, more than trucks, just SUVs alone. And so if we can, if we go to these people and demonize them and say, get out of your truck, that's not going to work. Right? 80% of truck owners say they'd give up alcohol before they'd give up the keys to their truck. Right? So I'm not going to try and ask you to do that. But what I do think we should do is that we should give them an option that's way, way better. Right? You get to stay at home. You don't have to drive your truck to get your medicine, 1 ounce pill bottle that half of all Americans need every month. Instead, you can stay home and we'll send a light, battery electric, smaller vehicle. It's designed for pedestrian safety. And so we need to still do all those things to make transit great, active transportation, and make better land use decisions. But we also need to, I think, give people alternatives to these bigger trucks and SUVs that, at least for some of their trips, make it possible to leave it in the garage and have the right size vehicle bring you your stuff.
What's the biggest pushback that you all get?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think one big pushback we get is people want to see it in action to see for themselves that it operates safely. And so that really is just something that's going to take time and outreach. We also often get a question about, automation. What's the impact going to be on jobs, right? We've seen so many times when automation has meant the eliminating jobs. And so I think we've talked a little bit about the safety issue, but we've actually seen in our initial deployments a positive impact on jobs. And if you think about that in the grocery case, the reason is that grocery delivery is pretty nascent today. Only about 3% of groceries delivered in 2019. Obviously, that's gone up during the pandemic. We'll see what happens afterwards. But the reason that it's still so low is the cost. It costs about $10 to $20 on average to get your groceries delivered. And most families can't afford to add that to the cost of every errand. And so we think that this technology can help reduce the cost of home delivery of things like groceries because it's electric, because it's efficient with 2 compartments, it's got autonomy. And I think that will help bring down the cost and make it more affordable for more people to get delivery. And what happens then is, since there's so few groceries delivered today, those are replacing trips that you or I would take to the grocery store, right? And we're doing this unpaid labor of picking and packing our own groceries at the store. If a robot is doing the driving, then someone has to be hired to do that picking and packing. And so we've seen our retail partners actually hiring more people. And of course, we're hiring people to do the testing and deployment and maintenance of these vehicles and building them. So I do think this is a case where we'll see some growth. Maybe it's a little bit different than some of the other applications of autonomy, but we're just at the beginning of this journey. And so I'm sure there will be other benefits that we see in the future. But yeah, we often get a question about jobs, and I think it's a little bit nuanced and different in the case of delivery.
So I have kind of a funny question, whether I'm a weirdo or not. I actually like going to the grocery store. And even during the pandemic, it's a way for me to get out of the house. It's like my one trip now that's like my one trip to get out of the house.
Yeah.
I also like picking my produce. I squeeze my avocados, at least pre-pandemic I did. I like to check for mold on berries. I like to make sure that my garlic is not too small in the clove. Am I a weirdo in that sense? I feel like I understand that there's going to be a number of different folks that want different things, but it's interesting to hear that this is going to happen, and perhaps delivery is the way of the future in a way that I don't know if it's meant for me personally.
Yeah, well, so you're not a weirdo. I've been getting a lot of harder avocados over the last few months of this pandemic, getting groceries delivered. And actually, it's funny you mentioned produce. That's the number one thing that people say is blocking them from getting grocery delivery is when they want to pick out their own produce, and that's fine, right? We're talking about a $3 trillion market here. We don't need to get 100% of them to be delivered in order for this to be a valuable service to the community. What we found is that it's really valuable for some people, people that are maybe really busy or may live far from a grocery store, someone that may be in a wheelchair that can't drive themselves to the grocery store, can have it delivered to them more affordably. So I think there's a lot of people that it would be valuable for. The other thing I'll mention is there's a recent study that we commissioned. I mentioned some of the economic benefits earlier, and this was studied by a transportation economist group called STEER. And we asked them to look at what's the jobs, economic impact, hours saved. And as you might expect, the numbers were quite big, right? It was over $4 trillion of economic impact, over 3 million jobs created from the period 2025 to 2035. Right. So they said kind of the first 5 years, this is still growing, still nascent, but over the next 10, this could start to actually get to scale. And they did 3 scenarios. In that middle scenario, in 2035, so 15 years from now, and not the aggressive scenario, they said 23% of shopping and errand trips by car would be delivery AVs. Right? So this is less than a quarter of them, and it's still having that massive an impact. So I think as a society, we can get a lot of these benefits without actually having everyone to do that. If you don't want to get delivered, that's fine. There's probably some things you don't want to do yourself, right? It's not just grocery, right? It's also medicine. If you got a sick kid at home, do you really want to be leaving them to go to the store or putting them in the car to go to the store to pick up that medicine? Maybe that's something you want delivered instead, but you still want to do your own grocery shopping. There's all these different errands that we do in the week, and some of them we might want to get delivered.
Another interesting thing from that report was that 21 billion hours of time would be saved from people not having to do trips. That was the one that kind of stuck out to me. Another question I have that's kind of a little bit, well, not ridiculous, but just I felt like I wanted to be a little bit of a contrarian to a certain extent. Has anybody calculated the potential loss of like human interaction? You know, some of the only times when you interact maybe with people that are outside of your social circles are when you get on a bus or if you go to the grocery store or if you're in public in certain ways. Is there something that's been calculated that talks about that kind of that loss of connectivity with people around you?
I haven't seen numbers on that, but it's a great point. We're already seeing an increase in delivery, right? And how do we make sure that we are not losing that human interaction? Some of the best interactions in my community have been riding the bus and just talking to someone while I wait at the bus stop with 40 grocery bags. And so I do think that that's really important. A friendly robot is nice. I'm sure it has some interactive value, but it's not the same as actually getting to know people in your community. So yeah, I think as a society we need to still do that. I do think there are things that we could do at the time other than shopping and running errands that might be more valuable interactions. So how do we make sure that the time we get back from this, those 21 billion hours, that we don't use them just to stream TV or to just work longer hours? I was reading about the washing machine and the dryer and the vacuum. And when the vacuum came out, it saved a ton of time. And that, especially for what at that time was mostly women doing housework and is still today often women. But what ended up happening is people spent that additional time on cleaning twice as often, right? That's not what we want people to have to do with this extra time. So I think as a society, we need to make sure that we have great things that people can do. They have the childcare they need to go out and do what they're passionate about, that they have access to the transportation, to those valuable, enriching facilities, that they've got good access to parks where they can teach their kids to play basketball and so forth. Make sure that we are investing in our communities broadly so that we can use this time that might otherwise have fortuitous interactions to do more fortuitous interactions in our communities while having maybe a little more fun.
Do you see a difference in street design in the future that would accommodate more of these delivery vehicles?
So everything that a human driver needs to drive safely is helpful for a autonomous vehicle, right? Clear lane markings, well-maintained roads, protected bike lanes, all of that is helpful. And so when we've seen people in cities talking about safer streets and Vision Zero, all of that actually is really helpful for us. Right? It's because it's meaning that we have the infrastructure for automotive vehicles to operate safely and protect vulnerable road users. So you've heard some people say, oh, we should make pedestrians install something on their phone or have a beeper on them so that we don't, that's not the answer. I don't think that that's right. Some people say we should reinvent our infrastructure and have new dedicated lanes. I don't think more lanes is the answer. We really think that we should embed in the existing infrastructure and operate in the world as it is and put everything on our vehicle that we need to operate safely. I think that's the best way to scale. As it is now, we struggle to maintain all the infrastructure that we have, especially the roadways, and we aren't investing as much as we need to in other modes. So asking our government to build new infrastructure is probably not the best strategy to grow our service. I think everything that's good for a community will help us in the end as well.
Your vehicle is a bit larger than some of the other delivery vehicles that I've seen in the wild. There's the smaller ones that folks worry about driving on sidewalks and things like that. I imagine that your vehicle is designed specifically for streets alone and not other pathways.
Exactly. Yeah, it's just for the street. So we're not a sidewalk robot. I think the reason for that is
It sounds like a funny sidewalk robot.
I'm sure they prefer another term, but just to distinguish, we don't go on the sidewalk, we go on the road. It's a motor vehicle. And ultimately, it'll be going 45 miles an hour, hopefully, one day, which means you definitely don't want to be on the sidewalk for that. I think the problem that we've often heard in urbanist and mobility communities is that America is built around the car in many cities. And so if you have a sidewalk robot or a bike lane robot, you're not going to be able to reach most of America. In Houston, where we launched, there's about 6,200 miles of roadway. Less than half of those have a sidewalk. There's actually not a good count available on this. And there's about 300 miles of bike lane. And so you're not going to be able to reach most people there. And that's fine. I think that all different kinds of robots are valuable. We don't want to discourage any of the others. They can be really, really good in certain applications that are close by. But we also have a mission of serving everyone. And it's very difficult to get to a food desert, for example, or to get to a rural area if you can't go on the road. And so we thought about starting with a sidewalk robot, but just that our mission of trying to serve everyone we couldn't do it with that technology. And so that's why we ended up going with an on-road vehicle.
I think 75% of those bikeways in Houston are probably in my old neighborhood of Kingwood. So if you look at the map of bikeways in Houston, just look at an overall map, there's this big cluster of them in the top right-hand corner of the map. It's funny.
I'm sure that's not a coincidence to why you were in Kingwood.
What's the most fun use case that you've heard for the potential of your vehicle?
Ooh, so I'll give you two. So one that I really like is peer-to-peer. So, think about Craigslist, and do you want to go to someone's house to meet them? Is it going to be exactly what you said it would be? Could we use these vehicles where you buy something online, they load it in a Nuro bot, and it brings it to someone else, right? Reuse. So I really like that idea. I also think that, something that's like a neighborhood bot, right? That has kind of what are those most common things you need in your daily life, and you just call it and it's there within 5 minutes. We're big bakers in this household, so yeast, flour, right? A bakery bot. I don't know how many times I've gone to the store and then come home and realized I've forgotten something that is critical to me getting cake and having to go back because it's always worth it for cake. Those are my two preferences. I'm sure that we can think of probably some other fun ones too.
At the beginning of the pandemic, I had decided to go big on my baking, and I bought the 50-pound sack of flour. So no more going to the store for flour. I bought a container and everything. It's under my kitchen table. And it goes, actually, we've already been through 50 pounds, which is surprising for two of us.
That's pretty impressive. We've definitely gone through quite a lot. Most recently got some shortbread and apple cider donuts.
Nice. Last week, we saw numerous transportation agencies, including MTC here in the Bay Area, discuss the potential for reducing greenhouse gas emissions through working at home. Our example here was, I think they said that they wanted to make it 60% work from home for large companies. And if you look at what the coronavirus has done to the peripheral economics of downtowns, restaurants, and services, I start to worry about what cities look like on the ground if everything's delivered. Is there a dark side to autonomous delivery? I mean, we kind of covered this before in my previous silly question, but I'm wondering if there's just kind of like a dark side into taking away that space from people interacting downtowns, from people working at home all the time, being connected, those types of things. It's a different kind of phrasing of the question, but I'm wondering if you all have thought about this.
Yeah, it is something we've thought a lot about. I actually think that our technology is designed to revitalize local commerce. Last year, 11% of all retail was done online. Now it's up to 16%. That means 84% in the coronavirus is still local commerce in person. But that 16% is taking off critical profits from local businesses. So I think that if you've got a situation where these small local businesses don't have the opportunity to compete, maybe they don't have enough volume to justify building a Amazon style warehouse or investing in their own proprietary truck for delivery, but they still need to compete with the free online delivery that takes 2 days. Well, what if they had a service like Neuro's that they could sign up with really, really easily and offer delivery within 30 minutes for a price, that's as close to free as we can get it? That could actually help them compete and help them stay open instead of everyone that has to getting it online. So if you want to actually support your local small business, you can still do it. If you want to go in person, it's there. And I think that could actually help them stay open into the future.
What's next for you all?
Well, right now we are focused on building out the city scale service in Houston. Houston, as you know, is a very large place.
It is very large.
We're still a few miles away from Humble, Texas, and so expanding beyond the area that we're in to more areas of Houston is our current priority. Once we can get to city scale, we'll want to start bringing this to new communities as well.
I'm just wondering, in terms of like regulations, in terms of adoption, in terms of what cities are willing to accept, I'm curious, like once you finish up your testing and stuff, do you think it'll be a quick adoption or do you think it'll be something that's a little bit longer? I mean, in the report, the middle scenario was just kind of a gradual uptake of services like yours. I'm curious, like if you personally feel like it's going to go faster or slower.
I think that once people try a service like this, they tend to love it. Not everyone, but our customer satisfaction is higher than Trader Joe's, which is the most popular grocer. So it's really, I think, a popular service once people get to use it because it's convenient. You get to stay at home. You don't have to drive to the store. It's lower cost than existing delivery services, and it's a consistent experience. There's a study that found that a quarter of people that have gotten food delivery, like hot food delivery, have had a bite taken out of it at one point. And I think that's...
I've never had that. I'm glad. I've never had that.
Well, congratulations on being spared that. But I just think that it's a consistent experience is what I mean to say. And so that it'll be more on time. It'll be in a particular place. You can set where it is once and then it'll always show up there. So I think it'll actually grow pretty quickly, but there will probably be a gradual introduction, right? Because the technology isn't going to be able to go everywhere all at once. It's not going to be like the two biggest revolutions in our cities of TNCs and scooters, where you suddenly had 1,000 overnight. I think it'll be more gradual than that because the technology will be able to expand where it can operate over time. So, right now we're operating in Houston. We're limited by the regulations on speed. We are not driving in snow yet, right? So we're not going to be just showing up unannounced in a new city and saying, hey, we're here, right? We're going to first do the mapping to make sure that we have our map for that area. Then we're going to be doing testing to confirm that the software is able to navigate it safely. And then we'll do a deployment. And I also think that we've had a lot of learnings from those prior two generations that community engagement before you deploy is really important. So we've made sure that we've done that in every area that we've deployed and give people, both city officials, but also law enforcement and the general public that are going to be interacting with these vehicles, the chance to interact with them in a static place where they're just parked. They can touch the keypad, see the doors open, understand how it works, learn about the technology before it comes everywhere.
What's been the response from your grocery partners?
When can we launch in more stores? I think that we've been really privileged to work with some great partners. Kroger is our nation's largest grocer. They're really having a digital reinvention strategy that this is one part of. So we're learning a lot from them, and we're excited about continuing to grow with our partners. We've also launched with CVS Pharmacy. They're looking to keep learning, seeing, well, what if we change this? What's the impact? How do we make sure the technology works to keep the medicine secure? And we're really working out those questions now so that we can grow to more stores.
Awesome. Well, Matthew, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Jeff. It was really great to be here. Appreciate you having me on, and I'm looking forward to continuing to listen to the show for 14 more years.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire on the web at theoverheadwire.com. Sign up for a free trial of The Overhead Wire Daily, our 14-year-old daily cities news list, by clicking the link at the top right of theoverheadwire.com. And please support the pod. Go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Many thanks to our current patrons for their ongoing support. And as always, you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Overcast, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts. And you can always find a digital home at usa.streetsblog.org. See you next time at Talking Headways.